fire climbed the flagship's spine in complete silence, and High Marshal Thalvok did not look away. No blast wave reached the bridge. No sound crossed the vacuum outside the viewport. Only the slow orange bloom spreading along the hull, eating through decks that had survived a dozen campaigns without a scratch. His tactical officer lay across the console, unmoving. Thalvok did not check for a pulse. He had counted the dead all his life. He knew the shape of it from across a room. The display in front of him refused to change. He tapped it twice, hard enough to crack a claw. The number stayed where it was. 0. 0 human capital ships lost. He had watched most of his own fleet turn to drifting slag in less time than it took to draw a full breath, and the enemy had lost nothing. That was the detail that would not leave him. Not the fire, the 0. Behind him, a junior officer named Reska pressed both hands flat against her console as though she could hold the ship together by touch alone. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her silence said everything her rank forbade her from saying out loud, that this was not supposed to be possible. 17 minutes, that was how long it had taken for an empire that had stood for 4,200 years to find the bottom of itself. Thalvok had led that empire's spear point for most of those centuries, had planted a flag on world after world, had never once retreated from a field of battle. He opened his mouth to send the only question that mattered. "What are you?" The channel was already dead. Had been dead for 6 seconds. On the other end, on a station he had never seen and would never see, someone had already stopped listening. I wish I could tell you the silence ended there. It didn't. Stay close. The quiet part is the part that matters. 2 days earlier, the Obsidian Citadel had rung with a different kind of silence, the kind that comes right before a room full of powerful people agrees on something at once. The chamber had been carved from the belly of a dead moon, its ceiling lost far above in a haze of torchlight and old smoke. Fossilized bone pillars ringed the floor, relics of some world the Varathi had swallowed before written memory. It smelled the way it always smelled in there. Old blood gone to dust, and the hot metal tang of braziers nobody had bothered to relight in 100 years. Thalvok stood at the center of it, cloak of conquered world soil draped heavy across his shoulders, and read the report on the 5th planet from a yellow star humans called Sol. Category 5. Primitive, few capital ships, kinetic weapons only, no drive faster than light itself. A species the Council had voted decades earlier, not even worth the paperwork of contact. Thalvok had conquered civilizations with better odds against him. He read the file once, set it down, and did not read it again. "They have made no attempt to expand beyond their own system," said the Council Secretary, a pale, reedy creature who never met anyone's eyes. "No war fleet worth mentioning, no colonies. Decades, and they have built nothing beyond their own front door. Then they have wasted their time," Thalvok said. From the gallery above, a small feathered shape shifted in her seat. Emissary Thessa of the Valley delegation had not been asked to speak, and by custom she would not be. The Valley held no military weight in the Council. Their opinions were tolerated the way a museum tolerates dust. But she had spent longer watching the 5th planet than anyone in that chamber, and something in the file's silence bothered her in a way she could not yet name. She said nothing. She had learned, across a very long life, that a warning offered before anyone wants it is a warning nobody hears. The vote came fast after that. It was not close. The war would begin the moment his fleet crossed the outer edge of the human system, and by every measure his intelligence officers could produce, it would end within a day of contact. He was wrong about the day. He would be wrong by nearly a full day more. "You seem certain," said General Korash, second in rank beneath him, as they walked the long causeway out of the chamber. Korash was younger, broader through the shoulders, and had a habit of asking questions Thalvok had already answered 100 times. "I have read their history," Thalvok said. "A species that does not expand does not fight. It hides, it waits to be found, and then it dies quietly, the way soft things always do. And if they are not soft," Thalvok stopped walking. It was the only time in the conversation his voice lost its ease. "Then they will be the first," he said, "in 4,000 years." He did not look back at the gallery as he left. If he had, he would have seen Thessa still sitting there long after the chamber emptied, her wide-set eyes fixed on the empty display where the file on Earth had been. Half the galaxy away, on a station humans called Guardian, it was deep into the ship's night cycle, and the coffee was burnt again. It was always burnt. Admiral Isara Vex had stopped noticing that a long time ago, back when burnt coffee meant something closer to home. She held the mug in both hands now, more for the heat than the taste, and ran her thumb along the creased photograph taped to its side. 3 soldiers, arms slung around each other's shoulders, a battlecruiser rising gray behind them. It had been taped to that mug for 4 decades. The tape had been replaced more times than she could count, the photograph never had. She was gray at the temples now, and she wore a leather jacket with a coffee stain on the left sleeve that had outlasted 3 uniform regulations telling her to retire it. Her voice, when she used it, never climbed above conversational. She counted to 5 before she answered anything that mattered. Long service in the fleet had taught her that most disasters started with someone who answered too fast. Her quarters were small and undecorated, except for one wall. On it hung a single sheet of paper, unframed edges gone soft from handling. A set of orders, 40 years old, that had never been rescinded and never been used. Final argument, convisional activation. She had read it so many times she no longer needed to. She read it anyway. Most nights, the way some people read scripture. Her door chimed. Admiral. Lieutenant Commander Chen leaned into the doorway, a stylus half-chewed at one end. He had spent years doing nothing but reading Varathi doctrine until he dreamed in it, and it showed in the way he stood now, too still, the way a man stands when he already knows what he's about to say will change the shape of the room. Rekun Ping just came in from the outer marker. Vex set the mug down. Which one? The one we hoped wouldn't? She counted to 5. Sound the protocol, she said. Quietly, down the corridor, Captain Vasquez was already moving before the order finished traveling. She had missing fingers on her left hand from a training accident long ago, and she'd learned to read a room a half-second before it spoke. She passed 3 junior officers on the way to the command deck and said nothing to any of them, but each one felt the air change as she went by and reached, without being told, for a headset. Commander Davies pulled a dozen displays up around her console without looking away from the small photograph of a Yorkshire Terrier taped beside her own monitor. "We've been ready a long time, Admiral," she said, not quite smiling as Vex stepped onto the deck behind her. "The dog's ready too. He's got a bag packed." Nobody laughed, but nobody flinched either. 15 recon missions, Chen said quietly, reading from a file that had sat sealed in a vault for most of his career. Lost across 40 years. Every one of them sent something back before it died. That's how we know their shield frequencies, Vex said. That's how we know their command patterns. That's how we know exactly how they like to lose ships they think they can't lose. She looked at the mug still in her hand, at the photograph, at 3 faces that would never age another day. Bring up the plan. The main display filled with a shape Chen had only ever seen in briefings, a lattice of firing solutions and staged intercepts, layered so deep that no single view could show all of it at once. It had a name inside the fleet that nobody outside the fleet had ever heard. Vex had helped write half of it herself, back when her hair was a different color, and the 3 soldiers on her mug still argued with her about whose turn it was to fly the late shift. "Talk me through the shape of it," Vasquez said, arriving at her shoulder. "There isn't a shape," Vex said. "That's the point. There's a sequence. Every phase ends before the next one starts, and nobody outside this deck sees more than the phase they're standing in. Command ships targeted first, then communications, then shield generation. In that order, every time, no matter what the enemy does in between." She set the mug down on the console, photograph facing outward, the way she always did before something started. Quiet reads as weak to something that's never had to listen for anything else. Somewhere below decks, a young technician named O.C. sat alone in a maintenance bay full of sleeping ordnance, and did the only job that had ever mattered to her. She walked the rows, one by one. "They'll fight the fleet they expect. We built one that isn't there yet. And if they don't cross the marker the way we planned for, they will," Vex said. "A species that is never lost doesn't change course because a smaller one is quiet." Checking each unit's status light by hand, the way her training officer had taught her a decade ago. Automated systems could fail silently. A human hand on a housing could not. She had done this walk more times than she had fingers and toes combined, and every single time nothing had happened. Tonight she did it anyway. The way you check a lock on a door you have never once found open. "Status?" Vasquez asked into her headset. "All green," Osei said. "Every one of them. Still asleep. Still ready. Copy," Vasquez said, and did not sound relieved, because she had not expected anything else. Chen watched the tactical plot update in slow, careful increments as the Varathi formation crossed further into the outer dark. There was something almost gentle about the way the enemy fleet moved, unhurried, confident, broadcasting a low, steady pulse on every open frequency that Chen's translation software rendered, after a moment, into words. "We come to correct an omission." "They think this is a formality," Chen said. "Let them," Vex said. "A species that's never lost doesn't check twice." She walked the length of the command deck once, slow, the way she always did before a long watch, touching nothing, saying nothing to anyone who didn't need to hear it. At the far end, near the observation port, Davies had gone quiet over her console in a way that made Vex stop. Something. Just doing the math again. Davies said, 40 years of quiet, and it comes down to the next hour. She looked up. Doesn't feel real yet. It will, Vex said, and kept walking. Back in her own small station near the tactical core, she opened a private channel not to the fleet, not to the council observers she knew were listening from a discreet distance, but to a recording she had made once years ago and never sent anywhere. She did not play it tonight. She only checked out of habit that it was still there. It was. It always was. Admiral. Chen's voice again, tighter now. Marker contact confirmed. They're crossing the line. Vex picked the mug back up. She did not drink from it. She held it the way some people hold a hand. Activate final argument, she said. The station did not erupt into motion. There was no siren, no shouted countdown, no voice raised above the one she'd used to order coffee an hour earlier. 3,400 minds that had sat silent and dark for 40 years began, one by one in perfect unhurried sequence, to open their eyes. On the tactical plot, the first faint proximity ring closed around the leading edge of the Varathi formation, a shape none of their sensors had been built to notice, because nothing that patient had ever needed to hide from them before.
Confirmed detection window in 3, Chen said, and for the first time that night his voice had gone very quiet. Then we wait, Vex said, and set the mug down where she could see the photograph.
The proximity rings closed in eerie geometric order, one after another, like a hand slowly folding shut around the Varathi formation. Nobody on Guardian spoke above a murmur. There was nothing left to decide. The plan had already decided everything, 40 years ago, in a room none of the people on this deck had been alive to sit in. The first mine detonated at the leading edge of the fleet. No warning, no transmission, no mercy shown to the ships that had never needed to ask for any before. The second followed a half-second later. Then the third, then all of them at once, a silent chain of light blooming across the dark faster than any single mind could track it. On Thalvok's bridge, alarms he had never heard before began screaming in a pattern his officers had no protocol for. Reska's hands moved across her console without her seeming to notice they were moving. Formation losses at 11%, she said, voice climbing despite herself. 15%. 18, report by ship class. Thalvok said, and his own voice did not rise, because rising had never once solved anything for him before, and he was not ready to believe it might be necessary now. All classes, Reska said. Command escorts, supply, even the reserve line. She looked up at him, and for the first time in the years she had served under him, he saw something in her face he did not have a word for in his own language. Sir, they knew exactly where we would enter. He said nothing. There was nothing yet worth saying. He watched the tactical plot instead, the way a man watches weather he cannot outrun, and did the only thing left to do. He counted. In under a minute, the fleet he had brought to correct an omission had lost a piece of itself large enough to have conquered a lesser world on its own. On Guardian, Chen read the same numbers off a cleaner feed and did not celebrate. Nobody did. Vex stood with both hands resting flat on the edge of her console, watching the plot the way she'd watched it in drills 1,000 times, except this time the shapes disappearing were real. Casualties on our side, she asked. 0, Vasquez said. Then, quieter. Still 0. Vex nodded once. She picked the mug up, set it back down without drinking, the way she always did when a phase ended and the next one hadn't started yet. 40 years of preparation had a way of feeling in the moment it finally worked. Almost anticlimactic. Almost. She let herself feel that for exactly as long as it took to draw one breath, and then she moved on. Begin phase 2, she said. The human fleet came alive not as a wall, but as a set of individual decisions, each ship already carrying its own target list, already briefed on exactly which Varathi vessel to find, and in what order to unmake it. Command ships first, then communications, then shield generation. Aboard the destroyer Halverson, a weapons officer named Petra Okonkwo, 26 years old, 3 weeks married. No ship waited for another. No ship asked permission twice. Her wife's photo taped inside her own console door the same way Vex's photo was taped to a coffee mug half a system away, fired the first coordinated volley of the human counterstrike. She did not know and would never know that she had just ended the career of a Varathi flotilla commander who had served for over 2 centuries. She only knew her board had gone from red to green, and that the ship beside her, the Aurangzeb, had already moved on to its second target before her own first kill had finished burning. That was the shape of it, small, fast, exact. 1,000 decisions like Petra's made in the space of seconds, each one invisible from the outside and devastating in some. Thalvok watched his tactical display lose coherence in real time. Ships that should have regrouped scattered instead, chasing threats that had already relocated before a targeting lock could finish. His command vessels, the ones built to think for the whole fleet, went dark first, exactly as if someone on the other side had made a list and worked down it in order. "They are not fighting a battle," Karash said beside him, and his voice had lost the easy confidence from 2 days earlier in the Citadel. "They are executing a sequence. I know what they are doing," Thalvok said. Down in Guardian's Ordnance Bay, Osei felt the deck hum beneath her boots as the second and third rounds of mines cycled through their firing patterns overhead, and for just a moment she stopped walking the rows and stood still, one hand flat against a cold housing. "I do not yet know why it is working." He would not learn the why for several more minutes. By then it would no longer matter. Listening to a war she could not see happening entirely because of work she had done with her own hands for a decade. Then she kept walking. There were still units to check. The war was not her job to watch, it was her job to make sure it never stopped being ready. At the 13-minute mark of the engagement, though nobody on either side was counting minutes anymore, only losses, a new voice broke onto the human command channel. It was not Chen's, not Vasquez's, not anyone who had spoken all night, it was Davies. "Admiral," her voice had lost its easy warmth entirely. "I'm picking up a distress beacon, not one of theirs." "Ours," Vex turned. "Which ship?" "The Halverson." A pause, too long, she took a hit on her second pass. Still moving, still firing. "But she's bleeding atmosphere." For the first time since the mines had opened their eyes, Vex's face changed. Not much. Just enough that Chen, watching from 3 meters away, understood he was seeing something he was not meant to see. "Casualties," Vex said. "Unknown yet." Vex looked at the mug on her console, at 3 faces that had never gotten the chance to grow old, and for exactly 1 breath she let herself remember why the number 0 had mattered so much to her an hour ago. Then she straightened. "Reroute the Aurangzeb to cover her retreat," Vex said. "The sequence holds. Everyone else stays on target." "Copy," Vasquez said, and turned to relay it, and did not look back to see whether the Admiral's hand had tightened, just slightly, around the handle of a coffee mug that had traveled 40 years to reach this exact moment. 0 human capital ships lost. That number, the one both fleets had built their entire war around, had just become fragile in a way nobody on that deck said out loud. It was still true. It might not stay true. On the Vairathi flagship, Thalvok finally understood what Karash had already guessed. This was not chaos. Chaos would have given him something to push against. What he was watching instead was a machine built from patience, executing a plan that had been finished decades before he had ever read the words Category 5. Primitive off a report he had not bothered to read twice. "Bring the reserve line forward," he ordered. All of it, and for the first time in longer than he could remember. "Now," Reska hesitated, only for a heartbeat, but he saw it. "Sir," she said, "the reserve line is already engaged." He looked at her. He looked at the plot. High Marshal Thalvok understood that the war he had walked into 2 days ago in a chamber full of old bone and older smoke had already been decided before he ever crossed the outer marker, and that everything happening now was simply the sound of that decision arriving. The Halverson was still transmitting. That was the first thing Chen said when the channel cut back in, static-laced and thin, Petra Okonkwo's voice barely holding together under the sound of alarms behind her. "Hull breach contained. Crew accounted for. We are still in the fight." A pause then. Quieter, almost embarrassed. "Tell the Admiral the ring didn't hold. She'll want to know that for the after report." Vex exhaled once, slow, and did not let it show on her face. 0 was gone. It had been gone the moment the beacon fired, but nobody was dead, and for now that was the only number that mattered. "Copy, Halverson," she said. "Hold position. Cover fire inbound." On the Vairathi flagship, Thalvok had stopped giving orders to the reserve line. There was no reserve line left to give them to. What remained of his fleet moved now on instinct alone, ships breaking formation not because anyone had told them to, but because formation itself had become a liability nobody had trained them to abandon. He watched a light cruiser he had personally commissioned 80 years ago try to retreat toward the flagship for cover, and watched it die 11 seconds later, caught between 2 human strike groups that had never once needed to speak to each other to coordinate the kill. "Sir." Karash's voice had gone flat, the particular flatness of a soldier trying not to sound like he was breaking. "Formation losses have crossed half." Thalvok said nothing. He was doing the arithmetic every commander does at the exact moment it stops being useful, counting what was left, and understanding, cell by cell, that what was left would not be enough regardless of what he did next. "Bring the flagship forward," he said finally. Karash turned. "Sir, that puts you in the strike corridor. I am aware of where the strike corridor is, General. It was not bravery. Thalvok did not think of it as bravery, and would not have used the word if asked. It was simpler than that. He had led from the front for over 1,000 years because a commander who would not stand where his soldiers stood had no right to send them there. He had never once needed to test whether that principle held when the soldiers were already gone. He was about to find out. 400 trillion kilometers away, in a small station corridor that smelled permanently of recycled air and older coffee, Admiral Vex left the command deck for exactly 90 seconds. Nobody questioned it. She walked to the observation window at the end of B corridor, where the light from Sol came through thin and gray and unremarkable, and she drank half a cup of water she did not want. She did this every engagement, always at roughly this point, always alone, because her hands needed something to hold that was not a mug with 3 dead faces taped to it. Not for these 90 seconds. She looked at nothing in particular. She let herself breathe. Then she poured the rest of the water into the recycler, straightened her jacket over the coffee stain that had outlived 3 regulations, and walked back to the deck exactly as if she had never left. She sat down. She looked at the plot, and the number on it had changed while she was gone. "Admiral," Chen said, and his voice had a different weight to it now, one she had not heard from him before. "Their flagship just moved into the strike corridor." Vex went still. "He's not retreating," Vasquez said. "He's coming forward." For a moment, nobody on that deck spoke at all. 40 years of planning had accounted for nearly everything the Varathi might do. Every formation, every doctrine, every recorded pattern from 15 recon missions that had died to hand this fleet its answers. Nobody had built a contingency for a commander walking toward his own destruction on purpose. "He wants to see it," Davies said quietly, "not through a screen. He wants to see the thing that's killing him." Vex looked at that for exactly as long as it took to understand it, and something in her chest that had been coiled tight since the minds first opened their eyes loosened, just slightly, into something closer to grief than triumph. "Then let him," she said. "Hold the sequence. Nothing changes." On the Varathi bridge, the strike corridor closed around the flagship the way it had closed around every other ship that night. Patient, exact, unhurried. Thalvok stood at the center of it and watched his own hull light up on the display, section by section. In the same order he had watched 100 other ships die in the last hour. He did not flinch. Reska, beside him, did. "Sir, we can still divert." "No," he said. "We cannot." He was right, though not for the reason she thought. It was not the trajectory that could not be diverted. It was something else. Something that had started 2 days ago in a chamber full of bone pillars and had been arriving, unhurried, ever since a certainty about the shape of the universe that had just come apart in his hands and could not be put back together by turning a ship. The first strike hit the flagship's outer shielding at what would later be measured, in reports neither side would ever fully agree on, as the 70% mark of the engagement. It did not kill him. It was not meant to. Vex's sequence had never targeted the flagship for a kill shot. Not yet. It targeted its weapons first, then its engines. Then, with the same unhurried patience that had governed every mine and every strike group all night, its ability to run. "They are not trying to destroy the flagship," Karash said, watching the damage reports climb in a pattern that made no sense to him yet. "They are trying to strand it." Thalvok understood before Karash finished the sentence, and the understanding cost him something he did not have a word for. They were not fighting to win. They had already won minutes ago, somewhere in the arithmetic of dead reserve lines and unbroken zeros. What was happening to his flagship now was not warfare. It was a verdict being delivered in slow motion, so that he would have time to read every word of it. "Open a channel," he said. "Sir, to who? To whoever is willing to answer?" It took 11 seconds for the request to route through, translate, and reach a small quiet station orbiting a planet he had dismissed 2 days ago, without reading the file twice. When the channel opened, there was no image on either side, only a voice calm, unhurried, a voice that had clearly said this sentence, or one like it, many times before in 40 years of drills that had never once been real until tonight. "This is Admiral Vex." Thalvok found, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that he did not know what to say to that. "This is Admiral Vex," she said again, when the silence on the other end stretched past what politeness allowed. "I'm told you wanted to see what was killing you. I thought you should hear it too." Thalvok's claws had gone white against the arm of his command chair. "You have destroyed an empire that stood for 4,000 years. "No," Vex said. "You did that 2 days ago." He looked instead at the tactical display, at the slow methodical collapse of everything he had built his life on, and found that the question he had planned to ask, the one he had been carrying since before the vote. In a room where nobody read the file twice, he had no answer for that, since the first report calling a quiet species primitive no longer fit in his mouth the way he'd expected it to. Reska's voice cut in, small and urgent. "Sir, engines are gone." "We can't run." "I know," Thalvok said, and did not look away from the display. Down on Guardian, Vasquez had gone to the small side counter behind the command deck and, without being asked, without anyone noticing until it was already done, poured a cup of coffee that nobody had requested. She set it at Vex's elbow. It was an old habit, older than the battle, older than most of the crew currently on duty, something Vasquez had done before every difficult call for longer than she could remember, the same way a person straightens a photograph before saying something true. Vex glanced at it, did not drink it yet, nodded once, which was thanks enough between the two of them. "Admiral," Chen said quietly, reading a number off his console that nobody had spoken aloud in over an hour. "Their fleet is down to 13 ships. 13 out of everything Thalvok had brought across the marker 2 days ago. Vex did not ask for the total. She did not need it stated twice. She had built this plan around a single outcome and had known the whole time what shape the ending would take. "Open the channel wide," she said. "Let them all hear it." On the Varathi bridge, the fire finally reached the section of hull directly beneath Thalvok's feet, and he felt the deck shudder in a way that told him without needing a readout that this was close to the end of what the ship could survive. Karash had gone silent beside him, watching the same display, waiting for an order that would not come, because there was nothing left to order. "What are you?" Thalvok said into the open channel, and this time the words reached her. There was a pause on the other end, not hesitation. Vex counting the way she always counted, 5 slow seconds, the habit of 40 years holding steady even here, even now. "We are the species you never bothered to finish reading about," she said. "We are done here." The channel went quiet, not because either side cut it, but because there was nothing left worth saying into. Fire climbed the flagship's spine in complete silence, and High Marshal Thalvok did not look away. No blast wave reached the bridge. No sound crossed the vacuum outside the viewport, only the slow orange bloom spreading along the hull. The same bloom he had already lived through once, except this time he understood exactly what it meant, and there was no channel left open to ask anyone what he was. The 13 surviving ships broke formation and ran, not because anyone ordered it, but because there was no one left to give an order that mattered. The tactical display on Guardian went dark, one grid at a time, until there was nothing left on it to track. The war room stayed silent for a long moment, 27 seconds, though nobody counted, because nobody in that room needed a number to know the fight was over. Chen was the one who finally spoke. "We won," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the second word, the only sound in the room that wasn't a console humming. "We finished," Vex said. She picked up the coffee Vasquez had poured for her and drank it, finally, and it tasted like every burnt cup she'd had for 40 years, and for once that felt like exactly the right thing to taste. Vasquez went back to the counter and made more, for everyone, without being asked twice. Davies pulled her display down, stood and said she was going to walk the dog, and nobody questioned it, because some routines exist precisely so a person has somewhere to go when the thing they've prepared for their whole life is suddenly, finally over. Chen lingered by Vex's station a moment longer than the others. "Why didn't we chase the 13 that ran? We didn't need to," Vex said. "They'll carry the story back better than any fleet of ours could." That was always the point. 3 days later, the council chamber that had voted 93 to nothing convened again, though the number this time was smaller and quieter, and nobody in it looked especially eager to speak first. Emissary Thessa, who had sat silent in the gallery through the first vote, was not silent this time. She played the recording of the final exchange for a room that had dismissed a planet without reading its file twice, and when it ended, she did not wait to be invited to speak. "I have watched them for 60 years, she said. "Longer than anyone in this chamber has bothered to watch anything that wasn't already useful to them. They were quiet because they were watching, waiting, measuring." She looked around the room at faces that had no answer for her. "You called that weakness. It was the loudest thing in the galaxy, and none of you were listening." Nobody in the chamber replied. There was nothing left to vote on. On Guardian, the ship's night cycle rolled on as if nothing unusual had happened at all, because that was in the end the entire design of the thing Vex had spent 40 years building, a fleet so prepared that its victory would look, from the outside, almost boring. She sat alone in her quarters afterward, The wall of old orders still hanging where it always had, final argument no longer conditional, no longer waiting for anything. She set the mug down on the small table beside her chair, the photograph facing her, the way she always turned it when something ended. 3 soldiers, grinning, arms around each other, a battlecruiser rising gray behind them. They had been dead for 40 years. The empire that killed them had burned in under 20 minutes, and somehow that fact sat in her chest without triumph, without much of anything she had a ready word for. She touched the photograph once, the way she had touched it 1,000 times before, on 1,000 quieter nights that had never once been real until tonight. Then she picked the coffee back up and drank it while it was still warm, and outside the small round window behind her, Seoul kept burning exactly the way it always had, indifferent to what had just been decided in its name.